The aircraft rolled so violently that coffee cups, phones, and loose bags slammed across the cabin floor. A child's cry was swallowed by the shrill warning alarms echoing through the fuselage. Outside the windows, black storm clouds flashed with lightning as the plane dropped hundreds of feet in a single terrifying moment. Inside the cockpit, both pilots fought desperately to regain control. One display after another went dark. Error messages spread across the instrument panel faster than they could read them. Then a calm female voice broke through the panic. Mayday, Mayday. Horizon Control. This is Falcon 7. I have control of the aircraft. Request immediate vectors to the nearest runway. The controller froze. Falcon 7. That call sign had disappeared from aviation records nearly a decade ago. Repeat your identification, the controller asked. The reply came without hesitation. Falcon 7. Maintaining partial control. We have multiple system failures and 192 souls on board. For a brief second, silence filled the control room. Several veteran controllers exchanged confused looks. One older supervisor slowly stood from his desk, staring at the radar screen as though he'd seen a ghost. It can't be her. Back inside the cabin, passengers had no idea what was happening beyond the locked cockpit door. Oxygen masks swung from the ceiling. Some people prayed through tears. Others gripped strangers' hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Flight attendants moved from row to row, trying to sound confident while fear showed plainly in their eyes. No one could have guessed that the person now guiding the crippled aircraft towards safety had boarded less than an hour earlier wearing a simple navy jacket, carrying a worn canvas backpack, and avoiding every bit of attention. She hadn't introduced herself. She hadn't told anyone about the life she had left behind. In fact, only minutes earlier, another passenger had politely suggested she leave aviation discussions to the professionals. Now those same professionals were depending on her to save every life aboard. But there was one truth none of the passengers knew. The woman holding the controls had made a promise years ago that she would never fly another aircraft again. So why had she broken that promise today? Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. 6 hours earlier, before fear replaced routine, the journey had looked like every other evening departure. The terminal buzzed with ordinary life. Business travelers hurried toward their gates while families searched for seats near charging stations. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the concourse, mixing with the constant rhythm of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements. No one imagined that Flight 728 to Portland would soon become the lead story on every news channel in the country. Among the crowd walked Mara Bennett. She kept her head down beneath the hood of a dark jacket, carrying a faded canvas backpack that looked older than most of the luggage around her. There was nothing about her appearance that attracted attention. She wasn't talking on the phone, rushing to catch her flight, or dressed like someone important. She simply blended into the endless stream of travelers. Inside her backpack rested a small leather notebook, its corners worn smooth with age. Tucked inside its pages was a tarnished metal insignia shaped like a pair of wings. Every time she traveled, she carried it. Yet she never pinned it to her jacket. Some memories were easier to carry than to explain. After boarding, Mara settled quietly into seat 22A, next to the window. As passengers filled the cabin, she opened the notebook instead of scrolling through her phone. The pages weren't filled with stories or sketches. They contained handwritten notes, observations, calculations, and faded reminders from a life she had long ago walked away from. Across the aisle, two off-duty airline captains laughed as they discussed recent simulator evaluations. "I swear these new co-pilots trust computers more than their own instincts," one joked. His friend chuckled. "That's because they've never had to fly when everything goes wrong." Their conversation caught Mara's attention for only a moment before she returned to her notebook. One of the pilots noticed her listening and smiled politely. "Long flight ahead," he said. "Hopefully nothing exciting happens tonight." Mara returned a faint smile. "I hope so too." As the aircraft climbed smoothly above the clouds, most passengers relaxed. Movies began playing. Reading lights flickered on. A baby finally stopped crying somewhere near the back of the cabin. Everything felt perfectly ordinary, except for one small detail. Through the soles of her shoes, Mara sensed a faint vibration beneath the cabin floor, an uneven rhythm so subtle that almost no one could have noticed it. She slowly closed her notebook. Her eyes drifted toward the nearest engine. Something wasn't right, and deep down she knew this flight was about to change far more than its destination. The strange vibration beneath the cabin floor stirred a memory Mara had spent years trying to bury. It wasn't just a sound, it was a pattern she had heard once before. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and the humming engines around her faded into another place, another time. 10 years earlier, before anyone knew her as the quiet woman sitting by a window, Mara Bennett had been one of the most respected experimental flight captains in the country. While other pilots flew scheduled routes, she flew aircraft that had never carried a single passenger. Every mission pushed new technology to its limits, and every landing determined whether an airplane was truly safe. Her mentor, Captain Nathan Cole, had one rule he repeated before every test flight. Machines speak long before they fail. Most people just don't know how to listen. Those words became part of who she was. Mara learned to recognize tiny changes in vibration, the faintest shift in engine pitch, and even the smallest delay in flight controls. Details others ignored often meant the difference between a safe landing and disaster. Then came Flight Test 314. The aircraft had performed beautifully on paper, but halfway through the evaluation, Mara noticed something hidden beneath the flawless data. A barely noticeable vibration passed through the left wing whenever the engines reached a certain power setting. The engineers dismissed it. The executives called it insignificant. The project leaders were eager to certify the aircraft before the year's biggest aviation expo, but Mara refused to sign the approval documents. "If this airplane carries passengers tomorrow," she told the review board, "someone won't make it home." The room fell silent. Instead of investigating her warning, the company accused her of delaying a billion-dollar program. Newspapers called her difficult. Television analysts questioned her judgment. Within weeks, contracts disappeared, invitations stopped coming, and the pilot once praised for her courage quietly vanished from the aviation world. Captain Cole found her packing the last box from her office. "You did the right thing," he said. "It doesn't feel that way." He placed a small silver wing insignia into her hand. "The sky never rewards pride," he told her softly. "It rewards honesty. One day when someone truly needs you, these wings will find their way back." Back in seat 22A, Mara opened her backpack just enough to glimpse the same weathered insignia resting inside. The engines hummed again. This time the vibration was stronger. She looked toward the wing, her heartbeat slowing instead of quickening. Someone else might have dismissed it as ordinary turbulence. Mara knew better. She had heard an airplane whisper before, and she remembered exactly how that story had almost ended. For the next 20 minutes, the flight seemed to settle back into its normal rhythm. The seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers relaxed once again. Some reclined their seats and drifted to sleep, while others laughed quietly over movies playing on the seatback screens. A young couple across the aisle debated where to spend their anniversary. An elderly man worked patiently through a crossword puzzle. The flight attendants rolled beverage carts down the aisle, smiling as if the night would pass without incident. Only Mara couldn't relax. She wasn't staring out the window anymore. She was listening. Every aircraft had its own rhythm, a combination of engine vibration, airflow, and structural movement. To most people, it blended into meaningless background noise. To her, it sounded like a conversation. And this airplane had begun saying things she didn't like. A soft tremor pulsed beneath her feet. It came, stopped, then returned again, exactly 12 seconds apart. Her eyes narrowed. That wasn't turbulence, it was mechanical. She glanced toward the wing. Nothing looked unusual from the outside. The engine fan continued spinning smoothly beneath the navigation lights. Yet something felt delayed, as though one engine was working just a fraction harder than the other. The beverage cart reached her row. "Something to drink?" the flight attendant asked warmly. "Just water, thank you." As the attendant handed over the cup, the aircraft gave a brief jolt. Not violent, just enough for the water to ripple. A few passengers looked up before returning to their conversations. Moments later, the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a patch of unstable air. Nothing to worry about. We'll leave the seatbelt sign on for a little while longer." The announcement sounded calm, professional, but Mara noticed something most passengers never would. There was a pause, barely half a second. Experienced pilots didn't pause like that unless they were choosing their words carefully. She quietly fastened her seatbelt tighter. Outside, the sky had transformed. The moon had disappeared behind towering storm clouds that stretched across the horizon like dark mountains. Lightning flickered deep inside them, illuminating the clouds from within. Then it happened. A dull metallic thump echoed through the cabin. Not loud enough to cause panic, but impossible for someone with her experience to ignore. Several passengers exchanged confused looks. One of the off-duty captains across the aisle frowned for the first time since boarding. He stopped talking. He had heard it too. Almost immediately afterward, the cabin lights flickered. Once, then again. This time, even the flight attendants looked toward the cockpit. Mara slowly lifted her eyes from the window. The conversation she had been hearing since takeoff had just become a warning, and somewhere ahead of them, the airplane had begun losing its fight. The next sound wasn't a vibration, it was an explosion. Boom! The entire aircraft lurched so violently that several passengers were thrown against their seatbelts. Overhead bins burst open, scattering backpacks and carry-on bags into the aisle. Glass shattered in the galley as the beverage cart slammed sideways, crashing into the cabin wall. For one terrifying heartbeat, silence followed. Then came the screams. The right side of the plane dipped sharply, sending the horizon spinning outside the windows. A mother grabbed both of her children and pulled them against her chest. Someone shouted prayers from the back of the cabin. Another passenger desperately reached for a phone, only to realize there was no signal that could help them now. The seatbelt sign flashed red. A piercing alarm echoed through the cabin. Then the oxygen masks dropped. Hundreds of yellow masks swung from the ceiling like falling leaves. Panic spread instantly. "Put your mask on first. Stay seated. Keep your seatbelts fastened." The flight attendants shouted instructions as they struggled to keep their own balance. Their calm expressions had disappeared. Fear was now impossible to hide. The aircraft continued losing altitude. Fast. Every second felt heavier than the last. A strained voice finally broke through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began before static swallowed his words. A moment later, the intercom clicked again. "If there are any current or former commercial pilots on board, report to the front immediately." The cabin froze. No one moved. Then, Mara quietly unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood. The two off-duty captains noticed her instantly. The older one stepped into the aisle, blocking her path. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this isn't the time. The crew needs qualified pilots." "I know. Please return to your seat." She didn't argue. She simply looked him in the eyes. Engine 2 didn't explode. He frowned. It suffered a compressor surge after a cascading electrical fault. If the crew shuts down the wrong hydraulic bus, they'll lose primary flight controls before they reach 10,000 feet. His expression changed. She continued without raising her voice. "The electrical failure isn't the real emergency." He blinked. "The structural sensor network is feeding the cockpit false data." Before he could respond, the cockpit door opened. The captain himself appeared. His face was pale. "What did you just say?" he asked. Mara met his exhausted eyes. "Your instruments are lying to you." The captain stared at her for a long second. Then, without another question, he stepped aside. "Come with me." As Mara disappeared through the cockpit door, every frightened passenger watched in stunned silence. None of them knew they had just placed their lives in the hands of a woman the aviation world had tried to erase. The cockpit door locked behind Mara with a heavy metallic click, shutting out the cries from the cabin. Inside, the atmosphere was even more frightening. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel like a wall of red stars. Continuous alarms overlapped until they became one relentless sound. The smell of overheated electronics lingered in the air, mixed with the sharp scent of burned insulation. Rain hammered against the windshield while lightning illuminated the clouds ahead in brief, blinding flashes. Captain Adrian Holt gripped the control column with both hands, sweat running down his forehead despite the freezing cockpit. Beside him, First Officer Liam Cross was desperately flipping through emergency checklists, his hands trembling so badly that he nearly dropped them. "We've lost half the displays," Holt said, without looking away from the windshield. "Nothing agrees with anything anymore." Mara didn't answer immediately. She scanned the cockpit. Not the warning messages, not the flashing lights, the airplane itself. She listened, felt the tiny vibrations through the floor, watched the movement of the control yoke. Then she reached forward and switched off one of the caution displays. Liam stared at her. "What are you doing?" "Getting rid of the lies." She pointed toward a secondary engine indicator. "That one." The captain looked. "The backup gauge?" "It's mechanical. It hasn't failed." Unlike the digital displays screaming catastrophic warnings, the old analog needle moved with calm consistency. Mara exhaled slowly. "The aircraft isn't dying the way your computers think it is." Captain Holt frowned. "You mean?" "The sensor network has collapsed. It's flooding your systems with false failures. You're chasing ghosts while the real problem keeps getting worse." She reached beneath her jacket and carefully removed the worn silver wing insignia from her backpack. For years it had remained hidden. Now she fastened it above her heart. The captain noticed. Recognition slowly spread across his face. "I've seen that insignia before." Mara ignored the comment. She settled into the vacant jump seat and placed one hand lightly on the center console. "Captain," she said calmly, "if you're willing to trust me, we still have a chance." Without hesitation, Holt released one hand from the controls. "I'm listening." She began issuing instructions with quiet confidence. "Disconnect the damaged sensor array. Cross-check only mechanical instruments. Transfer hydraulic pressure manually. Ignore every automated landing recommendation from this point forward." Each command had a purpose. Each action brought a little more stability. Then the radio crackled. Horizon 728, identify the specialist assisting in your cockpit. Captain Holt looked toward Mara. She took the microphone. This is Mara Bennett. A brief silence followed. Then an older voice answered from air traffic control. Captain Bennett? She closed her eyes for just a second. It's been a long time. The controller's voice softened. We thought you'd never fly again. Neither had she. But tonight wasn't about her past. It was about bringing 192 strangers safely home. The moment Mara finished speaking, the aircraft shuddered with a violence that nearly tore the controls from Captain Holt's hands. A shrill warning echoed through the cockpit. Hydraulic pressure low! Hydraulic pressure low! The control column suddenly felt heavier, much heavier. Captain Holt pulled with all his strength, but the aircraft barely responded. It's stiff, he shouted. I'm losing the elevators. Mara immediately grabbed the trim wheel. Don't fight it, she said firmly. Work with it. Together they balanced the aircraft, making tiny adjustments instead of desperate corrections. Every movement had to be smooth. Every mistake could send the jet into an uncontrollable dive. Outside, the storm had become a monster. Sheets of rain erased the windshield. Lightning exploded so close that the cockpit glowed white for an instant before plunging back into darkness. Violent crosswinds slammed into the aircraft from every direction, tossing nearly 200 lives through the sky like a leaf in a hurricane. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere was heartbreaking. Parents wrapped their arms around frightened children. An elderly couple silently held hands. The two off-duty captains who had once questioned Mara now sat frozen, realizing how helpless they truly were. One of them lowered his head, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken since childhood. Then, another warning erupted. The left engine suddenly surged before its power dropped sharply. First Officer Liam stared at the gauges. We're losing engine 1. Captain Holt's face drained of color. If that engine flames out, we won't reach the runway. Mara leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the mechanical instruments. No. She pointed at a vibrating pressure needle. It's starving for fuel. Liam blinked. But the computer says, the computer is wrong. Her voice cut through the panic with absolute certainty. Open the crossfeed valve. Now! For a split second, Liam hesitated. Then he obeyed. Nothing happened. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Suddenly, the engine roared back to life. The entire cockpit seemed to breathe again. Captain Holt looked at Mara in disbelief. You just saved our last engine. She didn't celebrate. She was already studying the weather radar. A narrow opening had appeared between two massive storm cells. It wasn't marked on any navigation display. It lasted only a few miles. There's our path, she whispered. The captain squinted through the rain. I can't even see it. You don't have to. She gently rested one hand on the control column. I do. The aircraft banked toward the tiny corridor of clear air, disappearing into the darkness as every soul aboard unknowingly followed the only route that could still lead them safely home. The runway didn't appear all at once. It revealed itself in fragments. A single white approach light pierced the rain. Then another. Moments later, an entire chain of lights emerged from the darkness like a lifeline stretching across the storm. There! First Officer Liam shouted, relief flooding his voice. Captain Holt could barely make it out through the sheets of rain. I've got it. Barely. Mara's expression remained calm, but inside, every instinct she had built over thousands of flight hours was working at once. Don't chase the runway, she said quietly. Let the runway come to us. The aircraft was still fighting them. Crosswinds shoved the nose sideways. The damaged hydraulics answered every control input a heartbeat too late. Even the engines refused to deliver steady thrust, surging and fading without warning. At 2,000 feet, another alarm erupted. Landing gear disagree! Liam's face turned pale. The nose gear isn't locking! Captain Holt slammed his fist lightly against the armrest. We don't have time for another checklist. Mara thought for only a second. We're not going around. She reached for the emergency extension handle. Manual release. The lever resisted. She pulled harder. Nothing. She planted both feet against the floor and gave one final determined tug. Thunk. A heavy vibration echoed beneath the cockpit. 3 green lights illuminated the panel. Liam let out the breath he'd been holding. Gear locked. But the danger wasn't over. Far from it. As they crossed the runway threshold, a violent gust struck the aircraft broadside. The left wing dipped. Passengers screamed. The runway lights slid sideways across the windshield. Captain Holt instinctively tried to correct too aggressively. No, Mara snapped. She gently steadied the controls. Small corrections. The wheels slammed onto the runway with a deafening crash. Boom! The entire aircraft bounced back into the air. Not high, but high enough to terrify everyone on board. For one endless second, no one knew whether the damaged landing gear would collapse. Then, the tires touched again. This time, they held. Sparks burst beneath the right landing gear, showering behind the aircraft like fireworks as metal scraped against the runway. "Reverse thrust," Captain Holt called. "Left only," Mara answered instantly. The jet thundered down the runway, shaking violently as firefighters raced alongside. The end of the runway grew closer. 800 meters, 500, 300. The brakes groaned under unbearable pressure. Finally, the aircraft rolled to a stop. Silence, no alarms, no screams, only the sound of rain striking the fuselage. Then, somewhere near the middle of the cabin, a little girl began clapping. One by one, others joined her. Within seconds, the entire aircraft erupted into tears, applause, and grateful laughter. Captain Holt turned toward Mara, his eyes glistening. "You didn't just save this airplane," he swallowed hard. "You gave 192 people the chance to go home." Mara looked through the rain-covered windshield, saying nothing. For the first time in 10 years, she finally believed she had come home too. The cabin door opened slowly. Cold night air rushed inside, carrying the distant wail of sirens and the flashing blue lights of emergency vehicles that surrounded the aircraft from every direction. For several long moments, nobody stood. The passengers remained frozen in their seats, as if moving might somehow erase the miracle they had just survived. Then a flight attendant, her cheeks still wet with tears, whispered, "We're safe." Those two words broke the silence. People embraced complete strangers. Parents kissed their children over and over again. An elderly man removed his glasses just to wipe away tears he could no longer hide. Even the teenagers who had spent most of the flight glued to their phones looked around in stunned disbelief, realizing how close they had come to never seeing another sunrise. As passengers stepped onto the mobile stairs, they instinctively turned back toward the aircraft, not to look at the damaged jet, but to look for the woman who had saved them. Mara was the last to leave the cockpit. She slipped quietly into the aisle, hoping to disappear before anyone noticed. She had never wanted applause. She had only wanted everyone to live. But before she reached the exit, someone began clapping. It was the older off-duty captain, the same man who had blocked her path only minutes before. He stood straight, emotion filling his tired eyes. "I judged you before I knew your story," he said loudly enough for the cabin to hear. "I've flown for 31 years, and tonight I witnessed the finest display of airmanship I've ever seen." The applause spread through the aircraft like a wave. Soon every passenger was standing. Some cried, others simply nodded with quiet gratitude. Mara lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with the attention. Outside, investigators were already examining the aircraft. Within hours, they uncovered something astonishing. The electrical fault had triggered a chain reaction that corrupted nearly every digital flight sensor, causing the aircraft's computers to generate dozens of false failures while masking the real mechanical damage. Had the crew continued following the automated warnings instead of reverting to basic flight principles, the outcome would almost certainly have been catastrophic. By sunrise, aviation experts across the country were asking the same question. Who was Mara Bennett? As journalists searched old archives, a forgotten story slowly resurfaced. Years earlier, she hadn't abandoned aviation. Aviation had abandoned her. Not because she lacked skill, but because she had refused to compromise her conscience when powerful people demanded silence. And now, the very integrity that had ended her career had become the reason 192 people were still alive to tell their story. 3 weeks later, the headlines had begun to fade. Television crews had moved on to newer stories. Social media found its next obsession. The flashing cameras disappeared almost as quickly as they had arrived. But for the 192 people aboard Flight 728, life would never return to what it had been. A father who thought he would never tuck his daughter into bed again now never missed a bedtime story. A young couple who had spent the flight believing they would die before saying, "I do," quietly married in a small ceremony surrounded by family. An elderly woman who had been traveling to meet her first grandchild finally arrived with tears of gratitude instead of grief. Each of them carried home an invisible reminder that life could change in a single heartbeat. Far from the spotlight, Mara Bennett drove to a quiet airfield tucked between rolling hills outside the city. The runway was short, the hangars weathered, and the wind carried the familiar scent of jet fuel and fresh rain. Captain Nathan Cole was waiting on a wooden bench overlooking the runway. Time had bent his back and silvered his hair, but the kindness in his eyes hadn't changed. Without a word, Mara sat beside him. For several minutes, they simply watched a small training aircraft climb into the morning sky. Nathan finally smiled. "I knew those wings would find you again." Mara reached into her jacket and placed the old silver insignia in his weathered hands. "I almost left it behind that night." He gently closed her fingers around it. "No," he said softly. "You almost left behind who you really are." She looked toward the endless blue sky above the runway. "For years, I thought losing my career meant losing my purpose." Nathan shook his head. "Purpose isn't something people give you. It's something you refuse to surrender." Those words stayed with her. Months later, Mara accepted an invitation, not to return as an airline captain, but as an instructor at the National Aviation Safety Academy. There, she trained young pilots to trust discipline over pride, judgment over ego, and courage over convenience. She never spoke much about the night that made headlines. Instead, she reminded every class that airplanes don't simply rely on engines or computers. They rely on people willing to make the right decision when it matters most. Because in the end, the greatest heroes are often the ones nobody notices, until the moment the world needs them. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes integrity still matters. You never know whose quiet courage might save lives when the impossible arrives.